Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for part 3 of our MDR web series. Today, we're going to be talking about post-market surveillance. We have about 30 to 45 minutes of a presentation for you. And the way we've structured this is leaving ample time open for questions. So we will be taking live questions. If you would like to, during the presentation, you can go ahead and type them in the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we're going to get to as many as we can. My name is Andrew Rossman. I am the general manager here at Globio. We also have two panelists today who are Patty and Mike. Hi, Patty and Mike. Thanks for joining us. I'll give you a full introduction here in a moment. I did want to mention that a huge thanks goes out to Greenlight Guru, our EQMS partner. Thank you for being so gracious in hosting this 3-part webinar. Little legal disclaimer before we get started. Any information presented today obviously should not be taken as consulting advice. In order to do that, though, we do have 1-hour free sessions that you can sign up for. We're going to drop that link into the chat here in a moment. It should also be available in our handout as additional resources. If you do want the downloaded copy in the handout section in the control panel, we do have that available to you. You will also receive the presentation in its entirety and an email post-webinar. All right, a little bit about us. So we spell our name a little funny. We have a silent X at the end. That's Globio. We are a comprehensive life science consulting firm. Our main focus is regulatory, quality, and electronic and enterprise quality management systems. We do anything for FDA, EU, ISO standards, etc. So now to introduce our wonderful panelists today, thank you for joining us, Patty. Patty Rossman is the president of Globio. She founded the company 11 years ago. She has a lot of experience in quality as well as regulatory for medical devices and pharma. She is also the co-founder of the Life Science Women's Network and the Life Science Women's Conference. Thank you, Patty. And for Mike, Mike Brillhart is one of our senior subject matter experts here at Globio. Mike has extensive background in regulatory and quality from medical device and pharma. His primary focuses are ISO, EU, and FDA standards. Thank you for joining us, Mike. Quickly want to go into a recap, or we're going to go into our agenda for today, what we're going to cover, and then we'll do a short recap of part 1 and part 2. So today we're going to talk about the definitions that are going to be involved in this presentation to kind of set the stage. We're then going to go into post-market surveillance plan, MDR requirements, as well as data sources. Again, from part 1 and part 2 of our series, in part 1, which you should have the link now in the chat. So if you wanted to view either one of these webinars, highly recommend it. You can find the link below. We talked about device classification and CERs. For part 2, we talked about equivalence and kind of the nuances around equivalence and establishing that, as well as going in a little deeper on some clinical investigation data. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mike now. We kind of want to set the stage, and what is post-market surveillance?
Hi, everyone. Like Andrew said, thank you very much for attending. I know that we've been very busy at Globio. I'm sure you're busy too, and we really value you taking an hour or so out of your day to spend with us. So, just as we get through these slides, just so you know how we do things for most of our presentations is we are really focused on the definitions in the MDR and taking wording directly from the MDR. That way takes away some of the opinion-based type of ideas that other people may have. They're still valued, but we want you to have that wording from the regulation when we're going through our presentations. And of course, like always, you know, with the limited amount of time we spend with you, we're not going to be able to cover everything. So we really encourage you to sign up for consultations with us so we can really get into the details about your issues you may have, your medical devices, or any questions, and have a more open discussion. Okay, so our definition, the only definition we really are going to post this time is the post-market surveillance. So like we talked about, this comes directly from the MDR Article 2. And I'll read through a little bit more information than what's on the slide. So it defines post-market surveillance as a proactive and systematic process which manufacturers must implement and carry out in order to take corrective and preventative action in accordance with information on medical devices and their performance. So the surveillance and reporting of incidents involving medical devices allow identification of problems with the design, manufacture, use of medical devices, and ultimately enhance patient safety. So the aim of post-market surveillance is to actively and systematically gather data and report that data when necessary. So, Andrew, I think we can go on to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit more, of course. So the types of things post-market surveillance should be looking for is to answer questions. So when you're designing your plan, these are the types of things you should look for really. How is your device actually being used? You know, when you're doing your research, you want to find out if it's being used consistently with the intention and, you know, kind of more importantly, as it's labeled. You know, is it being used differently? Do there need to be changes with the label? Are the labeling and instructions maybe not clear enough for how it's supposed to be used? Look to whom the device is actually being used for, which segment of the population. Again, you're kind of looking for those gaps in the clinical evaluation that you may have had initially putting the device on the market, or to see how things have changed. Does the device actually perform as expected? You know, that's what everybody wants with a medical device or something they're using. You have a problem, you need a medical device as the solution. Did it actually perform as expected? Did it do its job? Or are there some types of gaps? And then kind of a catch-all that the EU has and the FDA has, they always want to know, have things changed in the market? Are there newer options that exist for your device? Has there been a competitor that have advanced their device that you may be equivalent with, that you have to evaluate, that has changed the risk profile of that device? Thank you. So who's responsible for this? Of course, it's the manufacturer. It's responsible for, you know, doing a post-market surveillance. You know, and when is it required? It's required for everything, basically. You know, post-market surveillance is the responsibility of the manufacturer, and it's supposed to look at the entire life cycle of a device. So looking at our slide, you know, like we talked about, a systematic collection and recording, analyzing, and reporting of data. In other words, you have to have a plan on how you're going to get the data. It has to be systematic. You have to report what that plan is to the EU or to your notified body. And then how involved does your plan have to get? That is going to be dependent on risk. Like everything with the EU MDR, it's risk-based. And you're responsible for doing the, you know, your risk analysis on your device and using this data to update that risk profile and risk. So we have a couple of little phrases in here that kind of specify for class 1 device, you know, what's the difference in class 2, class 3, and then of course we have implantable devices also. So class 1 devices, you know, the wording gets kind of a little bit different. I'll read for that because I thought it was interesting a little bit. So post-market surveillance for manufacturers of class 1 devices shall prepare a post-market surveillance report summarizing results and conclusions of the analysis of the post-market surveillance data gathered as a result of the plan that's referred to in Article 84, together with a rationale and description of any preventative and corrective actions taken. So that's, I think, a key point in all of them. They want you to react to the data that you have collected. You have to have a corrective and preventative action, whether you're a class 1 device, 2 or 3 device, you have to take those actions. That's going to be the expectation from a notified body. And then the last phrasing for the class 1 device is report shall be updated when necessary and made available to the competent authority upon request. So another gray area, like all regulations, is always a gray area, updated when necessary. You get to decide that on your class 1 device is kind of what it's saying, but what it's also saying is you have to always have available when a competent authority asks for it. So you can't say you're going to, update it every 10 years and think that that's sufficient. So based it on risk, and I wouldn't go over, 5 years as far as having a completely updated report, but I would do it consistently throughout the year, looking for your data, going by your plan and updating your report to have it available when asked. Okay, so as you get higher risk medical devices, 2A, 2B, and 3, of course, you're going to have more and more requirements and a more regular reporting structure. So let me check here. So getting into those higher devices is when you start having your periodic safety update reports, which is just more detail. So that's over a class 1 device. And then class 3 and implantable devices that go a step further and make you do your updates electronically. So what I see when I read that information in a regulation is that, of course, as your device goes up higher in risk, that information needs to be made more available to the notified bodies so they can review it, and it would be reviewed more often. Okay, Andrew, I think I'm ready. Okay, we kind of talked about the articles in Article 83 and 84, and then what those drive down to is in the next section. It kind of gives the details of a PMS plan, which is in, I think, section 1.1 of Article or Annex 14, Part B. So the PMS plan, let me go to this real quick. Before we get into the post-market clinical follow-up. So the Annex 3 technical documentation on post-market surveillance is very detailed in 1.1 section B, and that's, has quite a few different requirements, and I'll just read through a few of them right now, at least. So again, just like we've talked about, a proactive and systematic process to collect information. Effective and appropriate methods and processes to assess the collected data. Suitable indicators and threshold values that shall be used in the continuous reassessment of the benefit risk analysis of the risk management as referred to in section 3. So those first few statements of it means you have to have a controlled and systematic method and plan, and it should be scientific based. So you're using values and threshold values to kind of control when you're going to take actions with the data that you collect. Okay, methods and protocols to manage the event subject to the trend report. Methods and protocols to communicate effectively with competent authorities. So methods and protocols means you have to have procedures and policies in place on how you're going to communicate your information to the competent authority. And of course, you have to follow those procedures and policies that you have in place. Then reference to procedures to fulfill the manufacturer's obligations laid down in Article 83, 84, and 86. And then effective tools to trace and identify devices that you may have to take corrective actions on. And then kind of the last phrase in there, and we'll probably talk about that on a later slide, is a PMCF plan, post-market clinical follow-up plan, as referred to in Part B of Annex 14. And we will talk about that plan just a little bit later, I think, on another slide. I think next, Andrew.
All right, perfect.
So why all these new requirements? Why all the changes and more focus on risk? It is an increased burden on the manufacturers, or it's an increased burden on everybody, basically, in this world. And it takes a holistic approach on the whole life cycle of a medical device. I think that basically it goes all back to patient safety and risk. They don't want someone to put an item or a medical device on the market and say that they're good, they've made their sales, and their obligations are done. This puts, details and a burden back on the manufacturer to continue to follow up on their device to ensure that it is safe in a market as more data is available, that it works as intended, and that they have kept up with any changes that are market related. So this is the method and the way to do that, to put those requirements into law, to make sure that people are following up and they're using controlled methods that are consistent to evaluate their medical device. So one thing that was put in here, no grandfathering, which means you're required to have a post-market surveillance and a post-market surveillance plan.
Okay. Hey, Mike, so from part 2 from our webinar, we did have a question. I know we're about to get into this post-market surveillance plan. An attendee had asked, we found an equivalent device with high quality and a large amount of clinical data. However, we don't have a clinical study or literature on the class 2 subject device. Do we still need a PMCF study?
So that is a good question. And it was a common question that we had on our very first webinar we did, kind of related to medical devices. And the questions were related to, I guess, what's the difference between a post-market surveillance, post-market clinical follow-up? So we'll start there first. Post-market surveillance is your plan as a whole to collect data and to determine that safety of your medical device and to report that information back to the notified body. Post-market clinical follow-up is a portion of that plan as a whole. It's combined with getting your complaints, your customer feedback, the other data you may be researching to ensure that you're maintaining equivalence of a device and updating your technical files. So you have the post-market clinical follow-up, and it's another kind of gray area that can get you into a danger zone, I think. So it's required, unless you can prove scientifically why it's not required. And I think that's a very difficult ask for people to be able to prove and to defend that why you said you're not required to do a post-market clinical follow-up. For the situation you brought up, Andrew, I think that it's even more important to have that post-market clinical follow-up plan. When you don't have that clinical data enough to begin with, you don't have an equivalent device that has, maybe a clear CER that was done in the past, or you can't benchmark someone else's study, then that burden of building that information would be back on that manufacturer. So when taking out the key word in there for the post-clinical follow-up is the clinical side. So that's a design study that you would develop and communicate in your plan back to the notified body that you're going to do. And it should be focused on those gaps that you may have that you can't find in a literature search. It should be focused on, if you have a higher risk profile for a certain part of your device, on gathering information so you can, really evaluate that risk benefit ratio and evaluate actions you may need to take on your device to reduce that risk. So it's a key part of the surveillance as a whole, and it's something that I think it would be difficult to justify not doing. There is that caveat, and it's at part B we were just talking about. A PMCF plan is referred to in part B, or a justification as to why a PMCF plan is not applicable. So I feel that it would be difficult to justify, and in that situation where they're basically saying they don't have the data, well, you have to go get the data and build your plan. Okay, for a PC or PMCF plan, I will send a link to Andrew here in just a second when I'm done with my slides. That kind of gives an outline of a plan that you can share in the chat. just so you can see kind of what the details that go into like the basic structure and some of the common requirements.
Ready for the next slide, Mike?
Okay,
Oh, sorry. There.
Yeah, next slide. So develop a PMS plan. When do you do it? You do it early in the process. You have to do it kind of at the beginning and submit that with your technical file to know what that PMS plan is, including the reporting dates, triggers, how you're going to be collecting data, how you're going to do your literature search, who is going to be responsible for different portions of the plan. Like I said, it's a key component of the EU MDR is the PMS, post-market surveillance. So you have to be thinking about that early on, prior to putting a device on the market, really to have that in place and kind of ready to go.
And Mike, we do have a audience question here really quick, and I think it kind of comes down to who to communicate the evaluation to. The question is, as a manufacturer within the U.S., how do you reach to competent authority? Directly reach out to competent authority, or always go via authorized representative route?
I don't think there's an always answer to anything with regulations. So I think the authorized representative is fine, but you're going to be responsible to the competent authority and the notified body. So whoever your notified body is, maintaining those good relations and asking for advice early is what I would recommend. Even if you're switching to a different type of activity to get their feel of what to do. And really, I think that's focused on kind of those gray areas and some of the regulations. There's some, even though the EU MDR I feel is very detailed, there's still some areas, of course, that it can't cover, or as things develop in the market, things change a little bit. So it's important to have that notified body's take and their expectations of the information that you need to provide, and also in the format that they want that information to be provided. Patty.
Can I add something to that? So if it is a high risk product, for instance, a 2B implantable or class 3, you need to submit it to UTMed, to the electronic database, and that needs to be done a minimum of at least once a year. And that's the same. The same is true of the IBD class Ds. They need to be submitted electronically as well.
I think Andrew had some information on dates for UTMed, right, Andrew?
Not off the top of my head here.
As far as when the data would be available, I think it was sometime later this year, right? In September, I think it was supposed to start to be available more widely as far as data to the public and things.
I believe that's when it's scheduled. We'll see if it is released. Perfect. Well, now let's talk kind of requirements for plan notification and reporting.
Okay, I think that it's, I'm going to turn this part over to Patty, although we'll still go back and forth, I'm sure, a little bit on the slides and questions whenever we can.
Perfect. Thank you, Mike.
It will help if I'm not muted, I think.
Right.
So you do have to, obviously, once you have your plan written and once you have worked your plan and you have your data, you have to submit that data or report on that data. So that's what we're gonna, we just talked about that a little bit, but now we're gonna talk a little bit more about that. So for class 1 devices, you need to produce a post-market surveillance report. It includes a summary of the results and the analysis of the data, as well as information about preventive or corrective action. And then for the class 3 devices, you need to submit a PSUR. And these are some of the things that it must contain. A summary of the results and analysis of data that's in the plan, information about preventive and corrective actions, of course, the main findings of post-market clinical follow-up, if you've done those, and like Mike says, most often you will have to do them. And then the conclusions on the benefit risk determination, that is the most important part of this, to determine if your device is still beneficial, who it's still beneficial to, and if there are any particular risks. So for instance, is there an age beyond which the risk becomes greater than the benefit? Is there a gender risk, for instance? Is there a risk based on body size? Those kinds of things are what you're trying to determine. And then finally, this is something that is not required by the post-market surveillance report for the lower risk devices, but for the higher risk devices, you want to know how big the problem is, how big the issue is, how big is the base of customers. So you need data on their sales volumes, your user population, and the frequency of use of this device. So this note down here is kind of just what we said. The PSUR must be produced at least annually, and for class 3 devices, it must be submitted to the UDMID database. You are going to continually gather, store, analyze, and report data, and there are potentially serious consequences for not keeping up with these reporting requirements in the new system. So just to sum that up, the PSUR is essentially an extension of the post-market surveillance report, and it does require you to include a rationale and description of your data and corrective actions taken for the product on the market. One of the things that is used quite frequently is the field safety corrective actions, and I just wanted to give you all a little bit of a definition for that. So FSCA, which is a field safety corrective action, is an action taken by the manufacturer to reduce the risk of death or serious deterioration in the state of health associated with the use of a medical device that is already placed on the market. So it is a field action. And before you actually take this action, you're supposed to generate a notification, a field safety notice. Unless it's an emergency, unless the danger of the device is very critical, then you can take your action before you submit your notice. But when you have a record of these field safety actions, corrective actions, it is imperative that you use this as part of your plan and reporting on this data. So field service recommendations could be things like returning the medical device to the supplier, modifications in the field, software updates, things like that, even device destruction if it's very serious. Okay, next, Andrew. So how do you collect all this data and how do you manage it? You definitely need infrastructure for the electronic data collection. Data will be collected from providers and patients. In some cases, it may be produced by the device itself. So if you have software that is generating data from the hardware and transmitting it or storing it on the device, you will have that electronic data captured. You can partner with providers, of course, keeping in mind patient privacy concerns. The ideal PMS system would take information from many sources and evaluate all the data as one set. Reactive data can be obtained from vigilance reports, audits, complaints, out of specification reports, and recalls. That should be combined with proactive data from your service reports, your literature, social media, real world evidence, customer surveys. Companies then need a set of processes such as prioritization algorithms to handle the incoming data and events in a timely and efficient way. And remember, you're not just collecting this data for post-market surveillance. This is already required within your medical device quality management system. You have to do quality trending, and you need to have your management review meetings within your QMS at least once a year and look at these kinds of trends. So you have a lot of this data already, or you should have that you're trending, especially that internal data, for instance, from complaints, from adverse events. But you do need some, if possible, at least. I know some young companies don't have this luxury, but if possible, you need an electronic storage area for this data. Next slide, please.
So, source of data. Here we go. Patty, so quick question. The regulations, they have everything required, right? So they tell you what's required, but they don't specifically tell you how you're supposed to implement a PMS. How would you go about approaching that?
Well, I'll get to that in a minute because there's a super reference that will help you. But I did first want to talk about some of the specific sources of data because it looks onerous and it looks like it's going to be very difficult to find this data. But I just want to stress that if you're running your quality management system like you should, and you're having management review and you're tracking and trending quality data about your device, you already have a lot of data on your hands that you can analyze. So for instance, complaints and adverse events. This is something that should be tracked and trended and reported to management at your firm. And hopefully you will have done something about it when you see trends. So that data should be readily available. Maintenance and installation records, that should be also readily available to you internally. Return medical devices, that should be readily available. And that's something else that you'll be wanting to report during your management review process. So post-market surveillance is not to be done in a vacuum. It fits into the rest of your QMS. And you're getting inputs from your PMS to provide information in your other QMS portions, such as design, such as risk management, such as labeling, product realization. So all this data needs to go back into your QMS and function as a safety quality type of data. So just to go through this a little bit more, the medical device registries, you probably won't have that data until you actually do searches for those. Your post-market clinical follow-up studies, like Mike was talking about, you may have those, you may not have those, but if you do, that's really good data because that's filling in the gaps, like Mike said. User training. You may be training your users, and if you're paying attention and you've trained your trainers to pay attention, your users during training may tell you things, especially about usability, that it's hard to install, it's hard it's hard for left-handed people to use it, for instance. The software has glitches, those kinds of things. I myself, or at Globio, our offices are part of a company called Med2Market. And Med2Market has a medical device laboratory here that brings in users for user training. And they have a wealth of information from these user trainings, and these companies that actually are doing the training themselves, and sometimes it's train the trainer. They have a wealth of information about difficulties with the device. And so if that is fed back into design control of your device, then that is really, really useful information. It serves two purposes. You put it in your plan, in your post-market surveillance plan, and you also use it in your management review in your quality management system cycle. So once again, this is not done in a vacuum, and it's not something that's new, or the MDR does place some nuances on it to make it better, but truly the process is really nothing new. You should have already been doing a lot of this, at least internally. Advisory notices are sources of information. The scientific literature, of course, on other devices, similar devices, is important information. Market surveillance activities by regulatory authorities, and it may be in some other country, but it's still good data. Public databases, social media. They're probably, at least in big companies, there are probably people within your organization whose responsibility it is to watch social media for complaints about your product, and to gather these complaints and compile them into data sources. Your distribution and tracking is a good source of data. Product quality information, which is most of these other things combined, really, and internal audit. So how does internal audit, how will that be a source of data? Well, for instance, your internal audit can look at things like whether or not your usability testing, for instance, has been developed to the point where it can catch usability issues and problems. And internal audits also will look at trending and look at your complaints and your adverse events and your internal CAPAs to make sure that those things are being captured and appropriately analyzed. And then also that whether or not those are making it to management review, and whether those things are being input into your risk management processes. So there's a lot of sources of data out there, and I'm sure we could have a whole webinar on these sources of data, but not today. Okay, next, Andrew, you were asking about how you do this, and so I wanted to point out this reference. It's not a full ISO standard, but it's a technical report, 20416, which is best practices for medical device post-market surveillance. It was published last August, and really it is a trove of information on specifically how you do your post-market surveillance. ISO 13485, of course, doesn't address it, and 14971, which is the risk assessment and management, don't address it on how to do it. But the technical report does share best practices on how to interpret the general post-market requirements of the EU MDR. 2/3 of the report, in fact, are dedicated to providing ample examples. For instance, data source examples, where I got most of the examples from that slide that I just presented, are in Annex A. Data analysis methods, and I mean really serious methods, are in Annex B. And PMS plan, there's a template for it, or a guide that you can follow in Annex C. So this is a really, really important reference for you.
Patty, question from the audience regarding this. Does this cover the PMCF as well?
I don't think so. It mentions it, but I'm not sure. I don't remember how helpful it is. I can look and get back to you.
Excellent.
How would we distribute that answer, Andrew? Do you have an idea?
Yes, I can go ahead and we can do it post.
Okay.
We can do it via email, not a problem.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, whoever asked that. I just don't remember everything that's in the technical reference, but I will look it up. All right, so we've identified sources of data. It's everywhere. Now what? So as part of the PMS, you've got to consider the proper ways to analyze it. ISO technical report 20416, which we just talked about, offers this advice. It should be determined which parameters are analyzed and what are the respective reference values. For example, batches, sub-batches, total number of medical devices manufactured, hours and frequency of use, number of medical devices in use, patient populations. As an example, the downtime, which is a parameter of an electric medical device, can be compared with its hours of use, which would be the reference value. Obviously, different sources of data, different kinds of data are going to be analyzed differently. And your chosen analysis method will depend on the type of raw data collected. Qualitative data from customers, for instance, complaints, is analyzed differently from quantitative reports in a scientific publication. The point is that you need to associate an analysis method with each source of data. And you can find that in Annex B of 20416. Next. So finally, you have your plan, you've collected your data, you've analyzed your data according to methods in Annex B or other methods that you may have and can scientifically document. But now you need to report it. So the output of the analysis will be the report, which should answer all the questions contained in your plan and provide evidence that you're meeting your stated objectives. The post-market surveillance report should generally contain a summary, the background information on your medical device, overview of the data gathered, how you got it, references to the sources of where you got it, how you analyzed it, how you evaluated it, recommendations for any actions that should be taken. So actions could include things like design changes, labeling changes, for instance, who benefits from the use of this device versus who might be harmed from the use of this device, clinical studies. Ultimately, you want to find out if the benefits of the device still outweigh the risk. So when you're finished with this report, you're all done, you can go on vacation, you don't have to think about it for another year or 2 or 3, right? No. When you're finished, do it again. And when you're finished again, do it again. Continuously do this. And it will make your life so much easier, actually. Don't wait until one time and then try to do it all at once. I think that's all we have on the content of the slide, Andrew. I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank y'all both. A lot of information out there. We did get a lot of questions coming in, so we're going to do our best, everybody, to get some of these answered. Anything that we're not able to, we will follow up with an email to you. If it's something very specific, it may be beneficial to schedule an hour consultation with us. It's free. You don't have to use the whole hour if you don't want to, but we can really start to dive in deep on some of these questions.
Yeah, just a caveat on the consultation. It's really not a sales pitch. It's really not a method to capture you and find out about your company. It's really a chance to help you. And like Andrew says, you can have one question for 5 minutes. That's okay. It's freely is given, and hopefully you will accept that it's freely given.
Thank you for that, Patty. So starting with a question here, I'm going to rephrase this question a little bit so it makes sense to everybody. If you have a product family, for instance, this one was a stent system with 3 brand names, do you need a different PMCF plan for each brand name?
You are breaking up a little bit, Andrew, but if you have a family of products like a stent or products that are essentially the same, just under different brand names, I don't think you would need a different plan, post-market clinical plan to gather data and evaluate that device. But the reporting of it would still have to be for each individually registered medical device anyway. But that doesn't mean a lot of the data you're collecting, if it's the same for multiple medical devices, at least you've got that data and can put it in these different reports.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
Yeah.
when we are talking about this, one thing we kind of glossed over a little bit that's related is when you are developing your PMS is to make sure you're including a way to evaluate your competitors and equivalent device data. You can't ignore if there's an adverse event on a similar device out there, doesn't have an impact to your device. Make sure you're looking that also.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I wanted to add too with the family of stents, for instance, if it truly is just branded in a different way, that's fine. You can use all the same plan. But if the labeling is different, for instance, you may need to, within your plan, talk about those differences in labeling and make sure that labeling does not allow one brand to be used for one thing and another brand used for another thing. So you have to really analyze when you say they're exactly the same, make sure that they really are exactly the same.
Yeah, I think there's a cautionary tale there. If you're saying something's all the same and it's not, you end up with some type of a higher risk on one of those items in your family, an adverse event. It's not like you can pick and choose the data you're going to now provide that you set into the family of groups. It's all the same. So just be careful how you're categorizing your devices.
Mm-hmm. And Mike, you just brought up kind of 4 similar devices and getting the data. One of our attendees had asked, what is used for publicly available information on similar devices? I know we've discussed this in the past webinars as well.
You know, there may not be public information for some of these devices. You can use the same sources that Patty mentioned, but this is why you get into those equivalency requirements on some of those implantable devices and class 3 devices. Says you have to have access to the technical files and technical information for your equivalent device. That is why they have those types of requirements in there, is so that you can get data to continuously evaluate your device that you've claimed equivalency with. They don't make it easy. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have
but public information would be also scientific literature, or maybe not so scientific literature. Scientific literature that has been communicated in a way that the public could understand it might be another way to think about it.
Mm-hmm. Mike, I think another question for you or Patty, if you would like to approach us. In regards to the no grandfathering under this, is it appropriate to use information on the same device from a sister company in order to support your claims?
To me, that's the same as if you're using that data, then did you establish equivalency with this sister company or sister device? Are there portions of it the same that make that data valuable anyway? So I guess that's what you would have to decide if you're talking a sister company, like a company that you are partners with that are part of the overall larger organization. Definitely use their data. It should be available to you unless it's spun off sometime later, at least.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Sorry, going through all these. All right, here's the next question. We should have time for about 2 or 3 more of these. What is the difference in the information between a post-market surveillance report, Class A and B, and periodic safety update report for Class C and D? And I know you were kind of covering this, Patty, earlier.
Would you ask the question again?
Of course. What's the difference in the information between a post-market surveillance report, for Class A and B, and a periodic safety update report for Class C and D?
The difference in data?
I believe that's what they're asking, in the information. So I believe the data that's required.
Well, obviously, Class C and D IBDs would have more risk. So those would be the ones that are more likely to need clinical follow-up studies done. So that would be one difference in the information. And that's probably the main difference. But the information that you provide other than that is pretty much the same, except for that data, as well as your sales volumes, your distribution of the product, who's using it, what labs are using it. Eventually, is it a home test? Is it a test that has to be done in a high complexity lab? Those kinds of things would be used on your C and D type devices. Mike, do you have any additions to that?
Just a little bit. So really look at Article 86. It has some good detail for that safety update report. And it's really focused on safety information and pulling out that benefit risk determination type data. That's why you're looking at all of your sales to see how widely spread the device is, so it can have that proper evaluation. Of course, it would be a lot of the information that's going to go into a post-market surveillance report, but it's really focused down on that benefit risk and the safety reporting.
Is there another question, Andrew?
I can't hear Andrew right now.
Sorry about that. I put myself on mute. Yeah, we're gonna finish up here with 2 questions regarding customer surveys. That was a hot topic for some of these questions. So are customer surveys necessary or mandatory as PMS data resources?
I've never seen that a customer survey is mandatory, but I think it's a good way to get some data, and you have to take it with, that grain of salt. It's not scientific data, a scientific evaluation, but that may be the only way to get some data on how that device is being used, identify a customer by doing those customer surveys. And then you can design, you know, an evaluation based on that or based on a complaint and things. So I think it's the only way to get some types of data, and then you can drive to, you know, the more scientific evaluation based on that.
Right. And
yeah, I think it's a really good way to get positive data. So remember, we're not just looking at negative data or for negative data. We're also looking for positive data. We're looking for people who say, I've never had a problem with my hip implant, which we know there's probably not many customers that would say that, but I've never had a problem with my lancet. Let's talk about that. So there are positive results to be had from customer surveys that I think are important. You're not going to get that through adverse events. You're not going to get that through complaints. Probably the only way you're going to get it is through surveys.
mm-hmm. And this next question kind of feeds into that same, regarding the data collection, how do you justify the representation of the data obtained? For instance, in the case of a satisfaction survey, how many would be required at a minimum to start some trend? Do you need it proportionate to sales volume, or how would you go about that to make it significant?
Well, once again,
Statistics are funny.
I would base it on risk.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you have a high risk item and you have reason to believe that you need to do surveys for some reason, I would, you know, you want to send out as many surveys as possible, but your rate of returns is always going to be low. So you've got to realize that your rate of return is going to be low. It may not be over 2 or 3%, and make sure that you send out enough surveys or give enough surveys to patients or providers that you can at least see trends. You know, it is qualitative data, so you're really not going to be able to come up with statistically significant and scientifically significant data, but you do want enough so that you can see trends if they exist.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that that's not an exact answer, but the answer is there's no exact answer. It all depends on risk and what you're asking in the survey.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both. We are out of time for additional questions. There were about 10 we didn't get to today. We will make sure that we go ahead and follow up with everyone who asked that. If we see a similar trend in the questions, we'll definitely reach out to all attendees and provide you those answers as well. So thank you so much to our participants who were asking so many great questions today.
Thank you.
Yeah, want to go ahead and wrap this up a little bit. We do provide our contact information. So if you do want to reach out to any of us with additional questions, please do not hesitate to do so. I believe it's also in the handout section. You can find our on our website, info@globio.com. We'll all be able to see these emails come through, and we'll make sure we get you an answer. I want to cover a few upcoming events. The Life Science Women's Conference is going to be held March 2nd and 3rd. It's going to be an in-person event. We had scheduled it for next month originally. With the Delta variant, we are changing that date. So it's going to be March 2nd and 3rd in Tampa, Florida. If you do register and you want to save some money on any one of our tickets, we have the MDR 2021 as your coupon code. And then if you're interested in joining a virtual network that eventually will be live in person, Patty is the co-founder of the Life Science Women's Network, which has bi-weekly virtual connect calls. It's a great way to to explore different conversations around life sciences. It's a very great way to stay connected when we can't in person as well. And again, thank you so much to the Greenlight Brewery team. We couldn't have done this without you. Thank you for this research. A lot of time and effort into this as well. Thank you so much. And if you are looking for electronic quality management system, we highly recommend Guru, or if you're finding some issues with it. And that's the end of our presentation. Again, thank you so much. We have our feedback down below, and we'll make sure that you receive this presentation today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Mike and Andrew and Aaron.
Thank you.